The Alpha King ignores every woman until he falls for a wolfless omega made at first sight. The kingdom of Eltherus lay beneath a sky of gray clouds, its mountains jagged and wild, its forests deep with secrets. The wind whispered through the trees as if carrying old stories, ancient warnings that few dared to hear. Within the walls of the palace, the stone corridors smelled of dust, smoke, and history. This was a place where power ruled with iron, and fear walked beside loyalty. King Dorian sat on his throne, a statue of shadow and strength. His hair was black as midnight, his eyes colder than the river ice that ran through the northern valleys. To the court, he was untouchable, feared and admired. Many women had tried to catch his notice, but all were ignored. Dorian's heart was a locked chamber. No charm, beauty, or flattery could open it. He moved through his kingdom like a storm contained, calm yet dangerous, until a quiet disturbance arrived that would change everything. Saren, a young maid with hair like burnished copper and eyes soft as moonlight, walked nervously through the palace gates. She had no wolves, no bond, and no status. The world had abandoned her early. Her own family had left her at the age of 5, calling her defective because she could not call a wolf as other Omegas did. She had grown strong in quiet ways, learning to hide her sorrow beneath a gentle smile. She carried her simple linen dress and worn shoes like armor, determined not to falter, even as the echoes of whispers from servants and courtiers pricked at her confidence. It was the first day of her service in the palace, and she could feel eyes upon her, though no one dared speak directly. In the hall, gilded banners reflected flickering torchlight, and tapestries told stories of kings long dead, wars fought in shadow, and legends of curses that haunted the royal line. Saren's heart beat fast. Every step felt like a question. Could she survive here? Could she remain invisible enough to be safe? Yet, she was not invisible. Not to him. Dorian noticed her the moment she stepped into the throne room. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her hands folded politely, yet her eyes held something unusual, an honesty he had not seen in years. A spark he could not name flared in his chest, confusing him. He had ignored hundreds of women, each vying for his attention, but she made the air itself seem to pause. The courtiers noticed his glance, but they could not understand it. Whispers began to ripple through the room. "Why does the king look at her?" Some speculated it was curiosity. Others feared it might be something darker, something the king himself did not understand. Saren approached with care, carrying a tray of tea meant for the king's study. She bowed slightly, her voice soft. "Your Majesty, your tea is ready." Dorian did not respond immediately. His eyes followed her as she set the tray on the edge of the massive oak table. For a moment the court felt the air grow heavier, as though time itself had slowed. Saren's pulse quickened, not out of fear but from a strange sense of recognition, as if some invisible thread had connected her to the king. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and unsettlingly calm. "You are different." Saren froze. Different. She had been called many things in her life, weak, defective, invisible, but never that. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her eyes on him. He stood, moving toward her with measured steps. Each movement radiated authority, yet there was curiosity mingled with restraint in his expression. Dorian had faced assassins, traitors, and battles that would chill most men to the bone. Yet this simple, wolfless Omega stirred something he could not name. Something dangerous. The court pretended not to notice the exchange, but tension had begun to coil like a serpent in the hall. No one dared interrupt. Saren felt the weight of his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen, not for what she lacked, but for what she carried within. "You are not afraid," Dorian said, a rare edge of surprise in his tone.
I am cautious, she replied carefully, choosing her words as one would navigate a minefield.
"But I do not wish harm." A shadow crossed Dorian's face. He had been taught that power demanded fear and respect. He had believed it kept the world in order. Yet here was a maid, gentle and unassuming, who faced him with honesty rather than flattery. And something inside him shifted. Later that night, in the solitude of the palace, Dorian could not shake the image of her from his mind. He walked the cold halls, torchlight flickering against the stone walls, until he reached the gardens, a quiet place few dared to enter after dark. There, under the pale glow of the moon, he found himself standing where Seren had first bowed to him. He did not understand the pull, the way his heart ached without reason. He was a king, the Alpha, unchallenged in power, yet something as fragile as a wolfless maid had pierced the armor around his heart. And in that piercing, a shadow of fear settled over him. If I allow myself to feel, will it destroy me? Meanwhile, Seren lay in the small servant quarters, her mind restless. She recalled the way his eyes had held her, the tension in the air, the strange warmth beneath the cold exterior. Yet she also remembered the whispers of palace staff, that he was untouchable, unyielding, dangerous. Her heart ached with longing and fear, a mix that made her pulse quicken. She did not know why, but the thread between them felt fragile yet unbreakable. The following morning, Seren was tasked with preparing the royal study for an audience with visiting nobles. She worked quietly, arranging candles and smoothing papers, when the floor beneath her seemed to shiver. A faint growl, almost imperceptible, echoed through the chamber. She froze, sensing something unseen, and then she saw him. Dorian standing in the doorway, watching her as though measuring her very soul. "Step lightly," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "for the shadows of this palace are older than you can imagine." Seren swallowed, nodding, though she did not fully understand. The air felt thick with something ancient, something alive. And yet, in that very moment, she did not feel fear, only a strange pull toward him. That night, as the moon rose high, Dorian's dreams were haunted. He found himself in a dark forest, wolves circling a distant figure he could not touch. Seren's face appeared, pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with terror. The wolves howled, shadows reached for her, and he could not reach her. He woke with a start, cold sweat clinging to his skin, his heart pounding like a drum in the silent night. In the same hour, Seren dreamed of him, of a king cloaked in shadow, his eyes searching, longing, and filled with unspoken pain. She reached out, but the distance between them stretched impossibly, as if something beyond time and space kept them apart. When she woke, her heart ached with a longing she could not name, and a chill ran down her spine. The palace remained quiet the next day, but the tension between the king and the maid was palpable. Courtiers noticed subtle glances, the way Dorian's hand lingered near objects she had touched, the way Seren's breath caught whenever he passed. Neither spoke openly, yet the unspoken language between them grew. By the end of the week, rumors had begun to stir. The king had noticed a maid. Nothing more had been said, yet the mere notion was enough to unsettle the palace. Shadows seemed darker in the hallways, whispers followed every step, and an invisible current of magic, or fate, seemed to pulse in the air.
On the 7th night, as the moon climbed high, Seren wandered into the palace gardens to fetch herbs for the queen's remedies.
She paused near a fountain, listening to the gentle trickle of water, and there he was, Dorian standing silently among the roses, his eyes fixed on her. "You were in my dreams again," he said, voice low, almost hesitant. Seren's pulse quickened, and she looked away, cheeks burning. She began, but stopped, unsure what to say. Words felt meaningless against the pull of something larger than them. "The shadows are coming," Dorian continued, "and I cannot protect you unless I understand what you are." His gaze softened, though only slightly, revealing a hint of vulnerability that no one else had ever seen. Seren's hands trembled. She had spent her life hiding, surviving in silence, and now, standing before the most powerful man in the kingdom, she felt seen in a way that frightened her more than any curse or danger ever had. "Then we will face them together," she whispered, and for the first time her voice carried something like hope. The wind rose suddenly, tossing petals and leaves around them. A howl, distant yet haunting, echoed through the night, and both froze. It carried a warning, a reminder that the darkness outside the palace walls and within their hearts was only just beginning. And in that moment, a thread of fate tightened around them, pulling them into a story neither fully understood, yet could not escape. The palace of Eltheris had never felt smaller nor more suffocating. Even the sunlight filtering through the high-arched windows seemed heavy with judgment. The whispers of servants, courtiers, and nobles had begun to grow louder. They said the king, untouchable and distant, had noticed a maid, and no one could recall seeing anything like it before. Rumors festered in dark corners, and some began to whisper that the king was no longer the same. For Saren, each day was a delicate dance. She moved silently through the palace, cleaning, serving, and observing, always careful not to attract attention, yet always aware of the unseen eyes of the Alpha King following her. She had learned to live in shadows, but Dorian's gaze made her feel as though she were standing in the full glare of the sun. His eyes lingered, not in judgment, but in curiosity. A dangerous and intoxicating curiosity she could not understand. Dorian, meanwhile, struggled against a growing storm within. Each glance at Saren, each fleeting interaction stirred something he had long believed buried, something he had thought destroyed when his heart had closed. Power and fear had been his companions for years, but this small, wolfless maid made him feel a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to feel. He hated it. He feared it, and yet he could not look away. One evening, while the palace slept under a sky of silver clouds, Dorian found Saren arranging herbs for the queen's remedies in the quiet of the garden pavilion. The moonlight caught her copper hair, making it shimmer like fire in the dark. She looked up, startled, and their eyes met. "You should not be here alone," Dorian said, stepping closer, his boots silent against the stone floor. His voice carried an edge of command, but also a tremor of something else, something almost human. I am careful," Saren replied, her hands trembling as she tried to steady the small basket of herbs. "I know the palace can be dangerous." Dorian studied her, noting the quiet strength beneath her soft demeanor. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known," he said quietly. "You carry something hidden, something powerful, and yet you are wolfless." Saren flinched. The word wolfless had haunted her since childhood. It was a mark of shame, a sign of weakness in the world of Eltheris. But she did not step back. Instead, she lifted her chin. "I am not dangerous," she said softly, "and I do not need a wolf to survive." Something inside Dorian shifted. He had faced countless enemies, wielded power over men and beasts alike, and yet her quiet defiance unsettled him more than any blade or spell ever could. Days passed, and the palace became a stage for unspoken tension. Dorian found excuses to pass near her, to speak in hushed tones about trivial matters, to watch her from shadowed corridors. He began to test the limits of her courage, asking her to deliver messages to nobles, to attend minor duties that required poise and discretion. Saren carried out each task with care, aware that the king's attention was both a gift and a danger. The first true test came when a nobleman, arrogant and cruel, mocked Saren openly in the hall. He sneered at her wolfless nature, calling her less than a maid, less than a woman. The courtiers laughed, but Saren stood silent, her face pale but steady. Dorian appeared then, moving with the silent grace of a predator. "Step back!" he commanded, and the hall fell into an immediate heavy silence. The nobleman froze, his face paling as Dorian's cold eyes met his. "She is under my protection," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Anyone who forgets that will regret it." The man bowed quickly, muttering apologies, and the courtiers dispersed, whispering in awe and fear. Saren's heart raced, not from triumph but from the realization that her presence had drawn danger not only to herself but also to the king. That night she found herself standing by the window of her quarters, gazing at the moonlit mountains. Dorian's words echoed in her mind. "She is under my protection." It was an honor, yet a heavy one, for she understood the truth of his warning. To be near the king was to invite shadows, political, magical, and personal, that could crush her like a leaf in a storm. Meanwhile, Dorian wandered the palace halls, restless. He felt the weight of his own curse pressing against him, the ancient spell that had haunted his bloodline for generations. Every bond he formed carried danger for the one he loved. He had fought wars, slain enemies, and held kingdoms under his control, yet Saren's presence stirred a fear deeper than any blade, the fear of loss, of vulnerability, of a heart that could finally break. Days turned into nights of quiet observation and careful conversation. Dorian and Saren began to share small private moments, a brush of hands while passing candles, whispered words about herbs, stories of childhood dreams. Each interaction deepened a bond neither could name, yet both felt the pull of inevitability. One afternoon, while dusting the royal library, Saran accidentally knocked over a stack of ancient scrolls. Papers scattered across the stone floor like leaves in the wind. As she knelt to gather them, Dorian appeared behind her, silent as shadow. "Let me help," he said, his voice low. His hand brushed against hers as he picked up a scroll, and the sudden contact sent a shiver through her. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the air seemed charged with something unspoken, something forbidden. "Your hands!" "They are steady," Dorian murmured, not in admiration, but in recognition. "You handle things with care that most would break." "Even me!" Saren's face flushed. She did not know how to respond. Words failed her, yet she felt the truth of his observation in her chest. She was careful, yes, but she also feared what being noticed might bring. That evening, Dorian called for her. The court had long since gone to their chambers, leaving the palace quiet except for the faint creak of floorboards and the whisper of wind against the stone walls. "Come with me," he said simply. He led her to a secluded tower, high above the gardens, where the city lights shimmered like fireflies in the dark. The air was cooler here, and the silence was almost sacred. "You are dangerous," Dorian said, his gaze fixed on her, though his voice was softer now. "Not because of your strength, but because you matter. You stir something in me I do not understand." Saren swallowed. The words both thrilled and terrified her. To matter to the king was unthinkable, but to stir something in him, it was unimaginable. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Then do not speak," he replied. "Let the night be our witness." For a long while they stood in silence, the wind carrying the scent of roses from the gardens below. Dorian's thoughts wandered to the curse that shadowed his life, the curse that promised pain and loss to anyone he loved. He had lived his entire existence in fear of it, building walls around his heart that none could breach. Yet here she stood, unwittingly dismantling them, her presence like fire melting stone. Suddenly, the distant howl of wolves broke the silence. Saren stiffened, for even without her own bond she felt the meaning behind it. Wolves rarely howled without reason in Altheris. "It was a warning, a signal that the shadows were stirring, that forces beyond them were awakening." Dorian's jaw tightened. "They know of her," he said, more to himself than to her. "And they are coming." Saren's hands trembled. "Who are they?" "The shadows," he said, "and the curse that has haunted my bloodline for generations. You are caught in it now, whether you wish it or not." Fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Then we face it together," she said firmly, echoing the words she had spoken before. There was a strange strength in her voice, a determination that made Dorian look at her with something close to awe. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You are brave," he said. "And I do not know if bravery will be enough." Days passed in a tense rhythm. Courtiers whispered of the king's obsession. The queen's advisors murmured about unusual behavior, and shadows lengthened in the palace corners. But Dorian and Saren found small moments of connection, a hand touched while passing a candle, a shared glance over stacks of scrolls, a quiet conversation in the moonlit library. Each gesture carried weight, each word built tension, and each glance tightened the invisible thread that now bound them together. One night, as snow began to fall softly on the palace gardens, Dorian found Saren standing alone, gazing at the stars. He approached quietly, his shadow falling over her like a protective shroud. "You are awake to more than the night, aren't you?" he said softly. She looked up, startled, then nodded. "I feel it," she admitted. "The shadows! The danger!" Dorian's chest tightened. "And yet you do not run," he said. "You stay."
Why?
"Because I believe," she whispered. "Even in the dark, I believe something can be saved." He stared at her, the words echoing in his mind. He had believed for centuries that power and fear were all that mattered, that nothing could be saved, not even a heart as broken as his own. Yet here she stood, brave, unyielding, and impossibly alive in the face of shadows. The distant howl of wolves sounded again, closer this time, more urgent. Saren shivered, but she did not step back. Dorian took her hand, holding it tightly. "They are coming," he said. "And soon you will see the full weight of what it means to be near me." Her grip tightened in return. "Then we face it together," she repeated, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Dorian's eyes softened, almost painfully. He had built walls, forged chains, and commanded armies, but none of that had prepared him for this, the impossible, terrifying, exhilarating reality of caring for someone he could not protect fully, and yet he could not turn away. A shadow moved in the corner of the garden, unseen by both of them, a reminder that their story had only begun. Something ancient, powerful, and watching waited for the moment to strike. And in that quiet, snow-dusted night, the bond between king and maid was sealed, not by words, but by a shared understanding, a fragile thread of trust and longing that neither could break. The mountains north of Eltheros were wild and untamed, jagged cliffs cutting into gray skies, forests so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. It was a land whispered about in stories, where wolves roamed in shadows and ancient magic lingered in the stones themselves. Dorian led Saren through this wilderness, the weight of the palace and its dangers pressing behind them, though neither spoke of it. The journey had begun after the palace council had grown suspicious. The king's attention to a simple maid had not gone unnoticed. Courtiers plotted, nobles whispered, and unseen enemies had begun to move. Dorian knew that staying in the palace endangered Saren, and perhaps even himself. The shadows were patient, and they were watching. Saren moved carefully, her copper hair catching the weak light of the overcast sky. She had walked through life invisible, but now the very wilderness seemed to test her. Wolves howled in the distance, not to threaten but as warnings. She shivered at the sound, and Dorian, walking beside her, noticed. "You fear them," he said quietly, though not unkindly. I respect them," she replied. "They are more honest than most people. They speak what they must." Dorian glanced at her, a faint smile brushing his lips. She was brave, yes, but her courage was tempered by wisdom and intuition, the very traits he had long forgotten in his own hardened heart. Her presence was a mirror, reflecting the man he could have been if the years of fear and loss had not bound him so tightly. They reached a clearing where the trees opened to reveal an ancient stone circle. Moss and vines clung to the stones, and runes etched into the rocks glowed faintly with an ethereal light. Dorian paused, sensing the weight of history and magic here. "This is where the oracle waits," he said. "She will tell us what you are, and what your place is in the shadow that hunts me." Saren's heart beat faster. The idea of an oracle, of magic older than any palace or crown, both terrified and intrigued her. She had grown up believing herself powerless, defective, and unworthy. And yet, now she walked with the Alpha King into the heart of a forest older than the memory of men, feeling as though fate had chosen her for something greater. The oracle appeared as they approached, an old woman, her hair white as snow, her eyes clouded yet sharp, her presence simultaneously fragile and commanding. She gestured for them to enter the circle, You seek answers, the oracle said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. But answers are never free. You will face the truth of your hearts, the history of your blood, and the dangers that follow you both. Dorian stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Saren. Then we face it together, he said. The oracle nodded and began a ritual, chanting in a language that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Light rose from the runes, weaving around them, and images began to form in the air. Saren saw herself as a child abandoned in a cold, empty home. She saw wolves circling, not to claim her but to watch, waiting for a bond she never had. Then she saw Dorian, not the king she had served, but a young man, fierce and desperate, standing over a battlefield, blood on his hands, a shadow curling around him like smoke. You are connected, the oracle said. His shadow, his curse, and your wolfless nature are linked. One cannot survive without the other. Your presence awakens what has lain dormant, and together you may either break the cycle or become its victims. Dorian's jaw tightened. He had feared this moment, the moment when the truth of the curse would demand a choice he had long postponed. To bond, to care, to love, it had always been dangerous. And now, the risk was greater than ever. Saren's eyes met his, full of fear and determination. I do not want to destroy you, she whispered. You will not destroy me, he replied, though his voice carried the weight of doubt. But I cannot promise that danger will not follow. Not just to me, but to you. The oracle extended her hand. Light gathered around Saren, and she felt a warmth unlike anything she had known. It was not a wolf's call, nor the faint hum of magic, but a deep, steady energy that seemed to resonate with her very soul. You are not weak, the oracle said. Your wolfless state is not a curse. It is a gift. The power within you can counter the darkness that shadows him. But it must be awakened, and he must trust you completely. Only then can the bond that threatens him become the shield that protects him. Dorian's eyes darkened. Trust. He had never given it freely, not in childhood, not in war, not in the politics of the throne. Yet here it was demanded of him, not as a king, but as a man. And he could not turn away. The ritual ended, leaving the forest quiet except for the distant howls of wolves. Saren's hands glowed faintly, and she realized she could feel the shadows, the danger, and the threads of the curse that had haunted Dorian for decades. She was no longer just a maid. She was part of something ancient, something terrifying, and something powerful. The journey back to the palace was tense. Each step through the forest felt like walking between worlds, and Dorian was acutely aware of the responsibility he bore. Serene had changed. He could see it in her posture, the way her eyes held a new determination. She had begun to awaken, not just her own latent power, but the ability to influence the curse that shadowed him. Back in the palace, danger awaited. Courtiers had grown bolder, rumors spreading like wildfire. One nobleman, ambitious and cruel, attempted to challenge Dorian openly, mocking the king's apparent distraction. Dorian's anger was swift and silent. He did not strike, but the courtiers knew he could. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Those who dared interfere with what the king protected would meet consequences they could not imagine. Saren watched him, noting the tension in his jaw, the careful calculation in his movements. She realized then that he was not invincible, not physically, not emotionally, not in the way she had imagined. And yet he bore the weight of the kingdom, the curse, and now her presence with quiet grace. Her admiration grew, tempered by the fear that the shadows were closer than ever. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the palace, Dorian found Saren in the gardens again. Snow had begun to fall lightly, blanketing the paths and rose bushes in a gentle white thyme. He approached her silently, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have changed," he said softly. "You feel the shadows, the danger, and yet you do not run. You embrace it." "Why?" "'Cause I do not fear them," she replied. Not completely. The shadows are part of this world. They are part of you. And I want to help. I cannot turn away when you face what you cannot face alone. Dorian's eyes softened, a rare vulnerability breaking through his stoic exterior. He had faced countless enemies, conquered kingdoms, and wielded power that would crush most men. And yet, it was her words, her courage, her willingness to stay that stirred something long buried, a hope he had thought impossible. Then we must prepare, he said, his voice low. The curse will not wait. Our enemies will not wait. And the shadows, they are patient. They strike when we are weakest, when we are careless, when we are divided. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had lived her life cautious and hidden, yet now she was part of a storm larger than herself. And in that storm she had found a strange certainty. She would not run. She would face whatever came, beside him, with him. Night fell, thick and heavy, and the palace seemed to hold its breath. Dorian and Seren remained in the garden, silent, watching the snow drift through the cold air. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, a reminder that danger was near, that the shadows were stirring, and that the path ahead would not be easy. But in the quiet, a bond had formed. It was fragile, dangerous and uncertain, but it was real. And for the first time, Dorian allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the curse could be confronted, the shadows challenged, and the impossible made possible. The wind rose suddenly, carrying a whisper of warning. A shadow moved at the edge of the forest, unseen, yet felt. The wolves howled again, closer this time, and Seren shivered, not from cold, but from anticipation. Danger was near. The curse was alive, and their bond would soon be tested like never before. The palace of Altheris had grown colder in the past weeks, as if the stones themselves sensed the storm approaching. Shadows gathered in hallways, creeping beneath doors, and curling along the tapestries. Courtiers whispered of unnatural events, of lights flickering where none should, of the king himself walking at odd hours with eyes darkened by thought. Yet, amidst this growing tension, Dorian and Seren moved together, stronger for the trust they had built in the northern forests, stronger for the awakening the oracle had revealed. Seren no longer moved timidly. She walked with purpose, her wolfless nature no longer a mark of shame, but a source of power. She could feel the shadows stirring around them, sense their movement in the stone walls, and even influence the darkness that sought to claim the palace. Dorian, the Alpha King, watched her closely. Every step she took, every breath she drew, was proof of her courage and her strength. For the first time in his life, he felt more than responsibility. He felt partnership, connection, and something dangerous and beautiful. Love. To allow himself to care, to trust, to show weakness, was to invite peril. He knew the cost of failure. The first attack came with no warning. One evening, as snow drifted across the palace gardens, a shadow slithered across the walls of the great hall. Figures cloaked in darkness moved with unnatural speed, infiltrating the palace through secret corridors and forgotten doors. The air thickened with a cold that chilled to the bone, a pressure that pressed against the heart. Seren sensed them before any of the guards, before any sound reached the halls. She whispered a warning to Dorian, and together they moved with fluid coordination. Shadows lunged from corners and hallways, dark, twisting shapes that carried the remnants of curses older than memory. Dorian drew his sword, the blade glinting under torchlight, while Seren extended her hands, channeling the dormant power that had awakened in the northern forest. The first strike was swift and violent. Shadow tendrils lashed at Dorian, but Seren intercepted, her power flaring in a brilliant silver light that repelled the dark energy. He glanced at her, astonishment and pride flashing in his eyes. "You are stronger than I feared," he said, his voice both commanding and awed. "Stronger than they know," she replied, her hands glowing with energy that pushed the darkness back. The palace became a battlefield. Shadows moved with purpose, attacking not just with physical force, but with fear, whispering cruel memories and doubts into the minds of those they touched. Courtiers fled, servants hid, and Dorian and Saren stood as the last line of defense. Each movement they made was a combination of instinct, power, and trust. Dorian realized that his greatest weapon was not the blade in his hand, nor the army he commanded, but the bond with Saren. She moved with him, anticipating danger, her presence anchoring him, giving him strength to face the unseen enemy. For the first time, he understood that love and trust were not weaknesses, they were shields. Hours passed in a blur of motion and magic. Shadows fell, only to rise again, relentless and cunning. Yet Serene's power continued to grow, her wolfless nature allowing her to move beyond the limitations of normal magic, to counter the curse with her unique strength. Dorian fought beside her, their movements in perfect harmony, each strike and each spell protecting the other. At the height of the battle, the largest shadow appeared, tall, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that burned like coals. It moved with deliberate menace, circling them, feeding off fear and doubt. Saren stepped forward, her voice steady. "It will not touch us," she said, though the tremor of effort was clear. "We face it together." "Then we end this," he said. His voice was calm, yet beneath it carried every ounce of power he possessed as Alpha King, as protector, as man. Together, they advanced. The shadow lashed out, but Serene's energy flared in response. Silver light met darkness, crackling in the air like lightning against a storm cloud. Dorian struck with precision, every movement a perfect complement to her magic. The shadow shrieked, a sound that echoed through the palace halls and walls, ancient and filled with rage. Yet the battle was not without cost. The shadows fed on fatigue, and even Serene's growing power began to waver. Dorian faltered slightly, feeling the strain of defending not just himself, but the one he loved. And then, in that critical moment, he remembered the words of the oracle. "Trust completely! Surrender fear!" He dropped the rigidity he had clung to for decades, the pride that had kept him distant, and he allowed himself to be fully present, fully vulnerable. "I trust you," he said aloud, his voice carrying through the hall. "I trust you completely." Saren's eyes widened, her own energy responding to his admission. Their bond, already strong, flared to brilliance. The silver light around her intensified, spiraling, forming a protective shield that pushed the shadow back. Dorian advanced, striking with renewed strength, and together they drove the shadow into a corner of the hall. With a final combined surge of magic and steel, they shattered it. The shadow dissipated, leaving a silence that was almost sacred. The air smelled of smoke and frost, and the echoes of the battle lingered in every stone. Serene's knees trembled, and Dorian caught her, holding her steady. Neither spoke for long moments, overwhelmed by the intensity of what they had faced. "You were magnificent," Dorian said finally, his voice low, filled with awe. "You faced what even I feared." Saren looked at him, her own breath coming in shallow gasps. "We faced it together," she corrected, her voice soft but resolute. "I could not have done it without you." Dorian's hand brushed against hers, lingering. "You have changed everything," he said. "Not just for me, but for this palace, for this kingdom, for me." The aftermath of the battle left the palace in uneasy peace. Courtiers whispered of the miraculous defense, of the king's renewed vigor, and of the mysterious power of the maid who stood beside him. Yet the most important change was the one no one could see. Dorian had surrendered fear, allowed himself to trust, and in doing so had discovered a strength beyond any blade or army. And Serene had embraced her gift, her wolfless nature no longer a weakness, but the source of protection and hope. In the quiet that followed, Dorian and Saren found themselves in the gardens, under a sky that was finally clear and filled with stars. Snow still covered the paths and rose bushes, glittering like diamonds in the moonlight. For the first time in months, the palace seemed almost peaceful, as if holding its breath after the storm. Dorian took Saren's hands in his, holding them tightly. "We have survived," he said, though his voice carried more meaning than the words alone could express. "And yet the future is still uncertain. The shadows may return." Saren nodded, feeling the weight of truth, but also a strange hope. Then we face them together, she said again, her voice firm, echoing their promise in the forest and in the tower. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the harsh lines of his face. Together, he agreed. And in that simple word, centuries of fear, pain, and isolation seemed to lift, replaced by a new possibility, a life where love, trust, and courage could coexist with power and responsibility. In the following days, Dorian took steps to fortify the palace against future threats, but he also made changes that reflected the new bond he shared with Saren. She was no longer invisible. She was a protector, a partner, a force of her own. The court adjusted, some with awe, some with fear, and others with envy. But all could not deny the transformation of the king and his maid. Saren, too, changed. The girl who had been abandoned, who had grown up thinking herself defective, now walked with confidence and purpose. Her power, once dormant, was awakened fully, and she understood that her wolfless nature had not been a curse. It had been a gift waiting for the right moment. She had learned to trust, to fight, to love, and in doing so, had found herself. One evening, as the sun set behind the northern mountains, casting the palace in golden light, Dorian and Saren stood together on the highest balcony. The wind ruffled their hair, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow. They looked out over their kingdom, a land they had defended not just with steel and magic, but with trust and courage. "You changed me," Dorian said softly, his hand brushing against hers. "I was lost in shadow, and you brought light." Saren smiled a gentle, luminous smile. "And you showed me strength I never knew I had," she replied. We saved each other in the end. For a long moment they stood in silence, feeling the bond that had been forged through danger, fear, and trust. Then, in a quiet voice, Dorian said, "The future will bring challenges, but whatever comes, we will face it together." Saren nodded, her heart full, knowing that their story was far from over, but that they had survived the darkest night and emerged stronger, united, and ready. Yet, as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, a faint howl echoed from the distant mountains. It was not menacing nor cruel, but a reminder the world beyond the palace was vast, filled with magic, mystery, and danger. They had won this battle, but the kingdom of Aelferis held more secrets still. And together, Alpha and Omega, king and maid, they would face whatever came, bound by trust, courage, and a love that had grown through fire and shadow.